Welcome to the Rime Buddhist Center's Dharma Talk podcast, Achieving Peace Through Compassion. This podcast is a recording of the Dharma Talks given during our Sunday service. This talk was given by Lama Matthew Palden Gocha.
Well, let me start this talk with a simple question. Have you ever found yourself replaying a conversation, not just remembering, but arguing it over and over again in your mind? Maybe the better question is who hasn't, because we would like to talk to you after the service to find out what your secret is. But we like to rebuild our case, sharpening our points, making sure, at least internally, that we're going to win that conversation if it ever comes up again. And that moment, it's not a failure of practice. That moment is the practice, because what's being revealed there very much is the self-cherishing mind. So let's begin by setting our intention with this Dharma talk. And we set our intention carefully with just this thought. May whatever understanding arises here not remain conceptual, but become something lived, something embodied for the benefit of all sentient beings. And that orientation, not just for me, is the grounding of our mind training. And as we've been learning these last weeks, Lojong is a systematic dismantling of one of the most deeply embedded structures in our experience. This conviction that I come first, that I must win, that my suffering is more urgent, that my perspective is more accurate, my needs are more legitimate. And this is what the tradition points to as that self-cherishing. And the teachings are not ambiguous about it. Self-cherishing is not just a problem, it is the organizing principle of samsara. So the aim here is not like some cosmetic change. It is to reverse the orientation of our heart so that the concern for others is no longer artificial, but instinctive. Now, this is crucial. It does not happen through inspiration alone. It requires constraint, it requires structure, and it requires commitments. And in our Rime tradition, we really make a point of honoring the full diversity of the Buddhist paths. We don't elevate one lineage over another. We recognize the foundational discipline of the Theravada tradition, the vast expanse of compassion of the Mahayana tradition, and the profound transformative methods of the Vajrayana tradition. And while those may seem quite different on the surface, their essence is actually the same. They're all pointing to this. How do we tame this wild mind of ours? And how do we open our heart to all beings? And so today we're going to bring that down to something very practical. We're going to look at how we move from the idea of compassion, the theory of it, into something lived, something embodied. And we'll do that through the commitments of mind training, drawing from the teachings of the great master, Geshe Jekawa. So when we hear the word commitments, sometimes it will be referred to as samaya. It can land a certain way. It can feel restrictive, like we're being hemmed in by the rules, like something is being imposed on us. But in the Dharma, commitments aren't chains, they're supports. They're a framework that holds the practice in its place, especially when our inspiration fades or when our habits start to take over. Because the truth is, we need that structure. Without it, the mind just follows its own habit patterns. And over time, if our actions consistently contradict these principles of mind training, something very predictable happens. Our progress stalls. And not only that, the good qualities that we've already developed begin to erode. And so these commitments aren't about control, they're really about protection. They protect the direction that we're trying to move in. Khentrul Lodru Taye Rinpoche begins this section of his book with a metaphor, and he says, and I quote, "If we plant a flower, we need protective parameters, such as a good fence to prevent deer from eating it. If we leave the flower unprotected, the deer may eat its first shoots, and so it doesn't grow at all. or they may eat it when it's partially grown, causing the plant to wither, or they will nibble it bit by bit, which will stun its growth. And so these commitments are the fence that protects the garden of the mind. Without them, even the seeds of wisdom cannot fully grow. And these are going to include the 16 specific acts to avoid. Again, not as rules in a moral sense, but because each one directly contradicts what we are trying to cultivate in our mind training. So rather than abstract philosophy, that gives us a very clear mirror of when the practice is alive and where it quietly slips away. Think of them more as a diagnostic tool. Each one reveals a specific way that self-cherishing reasserts itself. Each one reveals not crudely, intelligently. It disguises itself, this self-cherishing, as discernment, as justice, spiritual maturity, even the Dharma itself. So as we go through these, the question is not, do I agree with this? The question is, where does this operate in me right now? So before we get into the details of these 16 actions to avoid, the text gives us the first of the 16 as the 3 foundational instructions. And these are not preliminary, they are structural. If these collapse, everything becomes performance. So the first one is, do not contradict the commitments. And at first, this sounds obvious, but the commentary makes it very sharp. Even a single moment of contradiction matters, not because we must be perfect, but because the practice lives exactly in those moments. A flicker of irritation, a moment of quiet contempt, a subtle tightening around being right. That's where self-cherishing reconstitutes itself. So that this is not about managing dramatic failures. It's about recognizing the micro movements of ego and correcting them immediately. But we also have, do not allow our conduct to be confused. This is a warning about a very specific danger, mistaking conceptual understanding for realization. And the text gives us a striking example. Someone who believes they understand emptiness and therefore behaves as though cause and effect no longer apply, becoming reckless, performative, unconstrained. And we might not express it so explicitly, but it shows up in subtler ways. I understand this teaching, so my reaction is justified. This isn't anger, it's clarity. I'm just being authentic. And this is not realization, this is the ego appropriating the Dharma, and the corrective is very clear. If practice is genuine, conduct becomes more careful, not less, more precise, more attuned, not dramatic, but refined. And then the third one is not to allow our practice to become biased. This is where most practitioners quietly fail. We practice when it's convenient. When we're suffering, sure. When we're calm, sometimes. And when we're tired, irritated, or distracted, rarely. But those moments, that's the edge of the practice. So the instruction is deliberately blunt. If you are happy, practice. If you're miserable, practice. If you're clear, practice. If you're confused, practice. Exactly. Otherwise, what we call practice is just mood-dependent behavior. So a significant part of this training is really about how we relate to other people. And one of the main ways we break the fence of these commitments is through our speech, and even more subtly through our thoughts. Now, Ringo Tulku, in his book on mind training, puts it very clearly. And he says, the slogans of the 6 points show us the unwholesome attitudes or inclinations that might interfere with our practice. The mind is not always receptive or cooperative, and we need to constantly review our attitudes and ethical outlook. Now, within that structure, the 16 commitments become very precise. So that's what he's pointing here, is that this problem isn't just what we do, it's the underlying attitudes that quietly shape what we do. And those attitudes are not always cooperative. So now we move from principle to exposure, and this is where the practice becomes very precise. So the first one is change your intention, but act naturally. This one cuts directly into our spiritual performance. Transform your motivation internally, but do not advertise it externally. There's a traditional story of a monk who would loudly perform compassion so others would notice. Now, we don't do that in the same way, but we do signal our awareness, display our restraint, subtly curate how others perceive our practice. And the ego does not disappear when we encounter the Dharma, it becomes more sophisticated. So the instruction is exact. Transformation be inward. If it is real, it will show itself without announcement. Now, there's another slogan, do not speak of others' defects. This is not just about speech, it's about perception. When we repeatedly articulate others' faults, when we train the mind to organize reality that way, and in a modern context, this is constant, judgment is ambient, reinforced through our conversation, the media, internal commentary. And so the practice here is not repression, it's recognition. Every time I rehearse someone's fault, I strengthen the habit of separation. Now we have another slogan here. Do not concern yourself with others' affairs. The company I work for is, we work with adults with intellectual disabilities. And I remember when I was a house manager, we would always have people come over and want to report other people because they're not following the rules per se. And we would always have to remind people, whose business do you need to worry about? Because it's usually our own business. And so this classic image of do not concern yourself with others' affairs, we ignore a flaw the size of a mountain in ourselves, yet we fixate on the flaw the size of an atom in someone else. And that's not accidental. That's self-cherishing, protecting itself. So the instruction is immediate and practical. When judgment arises, interrupt it. Turn it inward, not as self-criticism, but as accurate redirection. Now, the other slogan we have is give up hope for results. That one's hard. This one's particularly uncompromising because it cuts into the hidden contract that we often make with our practice. I'm doing this, so something should be improved. My stress, my relationships, my experience. And when that doesn't happen, doubt arises, frustration arises. But from the perspective of Lojong, the issue is not a lack of results. It is the presence of expectation. Practice is not transactional, it's directional. We orient towards the benefit of others. If well-being arises, fine. But if that becomes the motivation, the entire structure collapses. Now, the next slogan is do not be dependent in the wrong way. And we might question, what do you mean do not be dependent? This refers to being dependable and holding grudges. And this is where practice becomes extremely honest because resentment can feel justified, even principled. But every time we revisit the injury, we entrench it, we stabilize it. So letting go is not moral generosity, it's really psychological clarity. The next one we have is do not retaliate. When harsh words land, the impulse is to respond immediately. And often we feel entitled to respond. But the teaching is not about politeness, it's about causality. Harm does not resolve harm, it extends it. Now, this is important. This does not mean passivity. It means examine the mind before acting. If anger is driving the response, it will not produce clarity. Now, the next one is do not wait in ambush. This one is the most psychologically precise teaching in the set. It describes a form of patience that is not patience, but delayed retaliation. Outwardly composed, internally accumulating, keeping track, waiting. It is not uncommon in most practitioners. And if I'm honest, I see this in myself constantly. Not in dramatic waves, but in these small, almost invisible movements of the mind. Don't believe me? Ask my wife. Which is why this instruction is simple. If you detect it, don't justify it. Return to your intention. Now, this next one is also one of my favorites. Do not transfer the ox's load to the cow. This addresses the reflex to displace responsibility. When something goes wrong, we instinctively locate the cause outside of ourselves. When something goes right, we internalize the credit. And this is not a moral failing, it's just a structural bias of our ego, which is why correcting it is so powerful. Taking responsibility is not self-blame, it is reclaiming the point of transformation. Now we have another one. Do not turn the divine into the demonic. This is perhaps the most critical warning. If Dharma increases pride, it has ceased to function as Dharma. At that point, it becomes an instrument of ego's reinforcement, and that's very subtle. We accumulate knowledge, we refine our language, we develop perspective, and without noticing, we begin to feel above others, more correct, more clear. And the question is extremely simple. If the practice is reducing self-importance, or is it refining it? And that answer really determines everything. The other one I wanted to share today, and we're not going to cover them all, but this last one I wanted to share was do not seek happiness in others' suffering. Okay, I see this one lands with a lot of folks. This is uncomfortable because it's ordinary, wishing for someone to fail so we can succeed, wanting circumstances to shift in our favor regardless of the cost. And the instruction is not to eliminate this instantly, but to recognize it without distortion, because unseen, it governs behavior. Seen, it begins to begin. So if we can step back, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Every one of these commitments identifies a way that self-cherishing disguises itself, not as something harmful, but as something reasonable, even justified, which is why the practice is not suppression, it's recognition, again and again and again. So how do we work with these? Well, the important thing is don't attempt all 16 at once. That will lead to burnout. Take one. Hold it in attention throughout the day. Watch how the mind moves in relation to it. And when you fail, which you will, do not reinforce that failure with judgment, just reorient. That repetition is the training. So I want to return to a phrase from the commentary. Make great progress, but with few outward indications. There is no need to act holy or separate ourselves from others. In a culture organized around display, this is deeply countercultural because the real work is invisible. It happens in the moment when you do not defend yourself, the moment you release the story, the moment you take responsibility without announcement. No one sees it, but those moments accumulate, and over time, they fundamentally alter the structure of our heart. The deepest practice is the one no one witnesses, and that is where the real transformation happens, not in what is seen, but is what is released. So I hope that this talk has been beneficial to you, and this week may you have compassion, wisdom, gratefulness, and joy. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Rime Buddhist Center's Dharma Talk podcast. Music was provided by Barefoot Bran Music. Please consider supporting the Rime Buddhist Center by making a donation at our website at www.rimecenter.org/donate.